The Beverly Hillbillies. The Deep Sea Dilemma. The bright California sun shone down on the sprawling estate of the Clampett family as Jethro Bodine knelt on the lush green grass. Beside him, the faithful but aging bloodhound named Duke sat with a look of profound confusion. Jethro held a small wooden branch in his hand, waving it enthusiastically. The young man looked at the dog and spoke with earnest determination, telling Duke that he was going to show him one more time exactly how to fetch a stick. From the nearby porch, Ellie Mae Clampett watched the scene with a sigh of mild exasperation. She leaned against the railing and asked Jethro if he could not perform his training sessions in the back of the house. She explained that Mark Templeton was expected to arrive shortly, and she did not want him to see Jethro crawling around on the ground like a nut. Jethro took offense at the remark, asking who she was calling a nut. Ellie Mae pointed out that he had been trying to teach that dog to fetch a stick for 10 years. Jethro defended himself by saying that such things take time and noting that Duke simply was not as bright as he was. Jed Clampett stepped out into the yard, observing his nephew's efforts. He asked the young man what he was doing, and Jethro repeated that he was teaching Duke to fetch, while expressing his concern about Mark seeing him. Jed told him not to worry. Ellie Mae, hoping to move the process along, called out to the dog and told him she had something much better than fetching sticks. She produced a nice, juicy bone and offered it to the hound. Duke immediately abandoned Jethro and followed Ellie Mae. Jethro watched in disbelief, remarking on how the old hound dog received a reward while he was the one doing all the tricks. Jed suggested that Jethro take Duke around to the back so they could share the bone. Jethro was horrified, asking his uncle if he truly expected him to gnaw on the same bone as the dog, calling the idea completely unsanitary. Jed agreed with a twinkle in his eye, saying that Duke might catch something from Jethro. With a grumble, Jethro led the dog away. Suddenly, Jethro shouted with excitement, asking Uncle Jed if he had seen the miracle. Duke had finally picked up the stick. Jed watched them go and remarked that Duke was likely taking it to the back so Jethro could fetch it for him some more, noting that the dog seemed to enjoy that arrangement. A moment later, Mark Templeton arrived. He greeted Mr. Clampett and Ellie Mae, but quickly turned to Jed with a word of caution. He advised them not to say anything to Granny about going into the water or turning Ellie Mae into a frog woman, as the mere mention of it seemed to upset her greatly. Jed agreed, but Mark believed he had found a way to win her over. He suggested that if Granny could only see the fascinating world that lies under the surface of the ocean, she might change her mind. Jed was skeptical, stating that no one was going to get that little woman under the water. Mark revealed that he had brought a projector, a screen, and some underwater film. He was confident that once Granny saw the wonders of the ocean depths, she would be hooked. However, before they could begin, the sound of a struggle erupted. Granny appeared, shouting for someone to let her go. She cried out that she was not going to the bottom of any ocean. Jed tried to calm her, explaining that Mark was only taking her there on film. Granny remained defiant, insisting she would not go on film or anything else, and called for Ellie Mae to help her before she drowned. Eventually, they convinced Granny to sit down, promising her a movie. She asked if it was a Western, noting her love for cowboy pictures. Mark admitted it was not exactly a Western, but felt sure she would like it. As the film began, Jed remarked on how interesting it must be to explore under the sea. Mark explained that it was not just interesting but necessary for the survival of the human race, as people would eventually need to learn to farm the sea to feed the world. Granny was not impressed. Looking at the underwater footage, she remarked that it looked like the time the creek rose and flooded the potato patch. When Mark mentioned farming the sea, Granny predicted that the farmers would end up with very rusty plows. She pointed at a manta ray and said it looked like an underwater bat. When Ellie Mae admired the fish, Granny simply stated that fish only looked good in a skillet. She firmly believed that water was for fish and land was for people. Mark tried to explain that many scientists believe humans originally came from the sea. Granny retorted that the only sea she came from was Tennessee. Ellie Mae expressed a deep desire to see the underwater world herself, but Granny told her she was acting like a nut. Mark told Granny that everyone had a right to their own opinion, but Granny snapped back that they did not have that right when they were wrong. She told Mark he should give up the frogman nonsense and become a cowboy, a range-riding, calf-roping, dust-kicking cowboy who raised babies instead of guppies. Later, at the bank, Milburn Drysdale was busy preparing for a visit from Mark. He had decorated his office with nautical gear and was wearing a naval uniform. When Miss Hathaway entered, she was bewildered. Drysdale explained that he wanted to impress the young Navy lieutenant who might one day marry Ellie Mae and inherit $50 million. He claimed that to Mark Templeton, he was Spunky Drysdale of the United States Navy. He even faked a limp, claiming it was a shark bite. Miss Hathaway was skeptical, but Drysdale insisted that they must think Navy. He declared the office a ship, himself the skipper, and Jane a member of the crew. Back at the mansion, Jed and Mark were discussing the future. Jed admitted that while it was hard for a dirt farmer to understand farming the sea, Mark's explanation made sense. Mark emphasized the importance of research and the need for money. Jed, knowing he had nearly $100 million, suggested that he might take 40 or 50 million and put it into oceanography. Mark was thrilled, and they agreed to talk more after Mark visited Mr. Drysdale. When Mark arrived at the bank, Drysdale greeted him with full naval ceremony. He told Mark that the Navy was in his blood and spoke of his years of self-sacrifice. He mentioned that Jed Clampett kept his fortune in the bank because of its battleship-like security. When Mark mentioned that Jed was considering spending $50 million on oceanography, Drysdale's attitude shifted instantly. He became outraged, calling the idea insane and claiming it was for the birds. He ordered Miss Hathaway to throw Mark out of the office and lock him in a brig, calling him a dangerous maniac. Drysdale quickly called the Clampett house and spoke to Granny. He warned her not to let Ellie Mae get serious about Mark, claiming the man was as nutty as a fruitcake. Granny agreed, saying she always knew he was a frog brain. They formed an alliance to stop the marriage, with Jethro joining their side. Meanwhile, Jed, Ellie Mae, and Mark were at the pool for another scuba lesson. Jethro arrived, carrying a bucket of frogs he had caught while fishing. He intended to give them to Granny, but Jed warned him that Granny was now making pets out of frogs and giving them names after family members. They decided to release the frogs in the pond instead. Drysdale arrived at the mansion and found the group at the pool. He was horrified to see them all wearing scuba gear, remarking that they looked like 4 frogs. He told Granny that Mark wanted to pour millions of dollars into the ocean. Granny suggested they seek help from Dr. Klingner, a psychiatrist. She believed the doctor could change Mark back from being froggy. The entire group eventually ended up at the doctor's office. Granny brought her bucket of frogs, convinced they were her family members who had been transformed. Dr. Klingner, who happened to be a scuba enthusiast himself, decided to help Granny overcome her fear of water by performing a demonstration. He went to the dressing room to put on his own scuba gear. When Granny saw the doctor in his wetsuit and mask near the pond, she panicked. She pleaded with him to get out before he turned into a frog. When he disappeared under the surface and a large frog emerged shortly after, Granny was devastated. She captured the frog in a sack, believing it was the doctor. Granny found the doctor's secretary, who was actually the doctor's wife. Granny explained the tragic situation, telling the woman that her husband had turned into a frog. The wife played along as Granny handed over the sack. Granny reminded her of the story, where a princess kisses a frog to turn him back into a prince. She urged the wife to try it, promising to leave, so they could have privacy. Once Granny left, Dr. Klingner appeared, perfectly fine and unaware of the confusion. His wife looked at the frog in the sack and then at her husband, laughing as she remarked that he was a handsome devil. The day ended with the family gathered together, still a bit confused by the world of the sea, but united in their love for one another. They had learned that whether on land or underwater, the most important thing was staying true to themselves. The sun set over the hills of Beverly as the family prepared for another day of adventures in their new home.